Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you all for finding time to attend our third IPA Power Hour webinar on CEJA's impact on the Illinois Solar for All. My name is Megha Hamal and I am the Communication Manager for the Illinois Power Agency. To get started, let's go over a few housekeeping items. Today's session is being recorded. A recorded version of this session will be available on the IPA website under About Us and Events, along with the PDF of the presentation slides this afternoon. To reduce any background noise, all participants are muted upon entry. Please feel free to ask questions at any time during the webinar. We will reserve some time towards the end of the presentation to address these questions. To submit questions, please use the chat feature at the bottom of the Zoom window. We have also enabled live transcript for the meeting today. If you wish to hide the live transcript, you may click on the live transcript button, then hide subtitle. In today's webinar, we will be covering introduction and scope of the IPA Power Hour webinars, Illinois Solar for All under CEJA, successes and challenges to date, key changes to Illinois Solar for All under CEJA, new requirements, and we will open up the Q&A forum towards the end. Our presenters for this session are Anthony Starr, Director, Illinois Power Agency, Jennifer Schmidt, Program Manager for the Illinois Solar for All. I would now like to give you all a quick overview on the IPA Power Hour webinar series. Power Hour is a newly launched series of educational and informative presentations on a wide range of clean energy topics and emerging issues. Today's Power Hour is our third Power Hour, and today's Power Hour webinar, we will provide an overview of the Illinois Solar for All program, discuss success and challenges of the program to date, and how the recently enacted Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, Public Act 102-0662, impacts the program moving forward. IPA Power Hour webinars will cover all the other topical areas impacted by the Public Act 102-0662 in the future. Here's a quick snapshot. In today's Power Hour webinar, we will not cover Public Act 102-0662 related to stakeholder feedback process, related to the Adjustable Block Program or Illinois Solar for All program, specific program or procurement requirements, issues outside the purview of the IPA, such as changes to rate making, changes to net metering, grant programs established and administered by the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, clean work, energy workforce hubs, electric vehicle, and transportation incentives. Here's a quick snapshot of the upcoming Power Hour webinars. The next one will be held on Friday, November 19th, and that would be our fourth webinar, and it would be on CEJA's impact on utility scale solar and wind and brownfield sites. This leads to my next slide, which is a brief introduction to the Illinois Power Agency. Illinois Power Agency is an independent state agency created in 2007. Agency duties include development and implementation of procurement plans for electricity supply for default service customers of Illinois electric utilities, development and implementation of other procurement plans, such as those that to support at-risk nuclear plants, such as zero emission credits and carbon mitigation credits, implementation of the Renewable Portfolio Standard, which includes development of long-term renewable resources procurement plan, conducting competitive procurements for utility scale projects, managing programs for community solar and solar for homes and businesses. This concludes my portion of the presentation. Now I would like to hand over the presentation to my colleague, Jennifer.
Thank you, Megha. My name is Jennifer Schmidt. I'm the Illinois Solar for All Program Manager, and I'll be going over the basics of how Illinois Solar for All has been working currently as created by CEJA. Next slide. So the Illinois Solar for All is an incentive program that was created by the Future Energy Jobs Act and is administered by the Illinois Power Agency to bring the benefits of solar energy and the growing clean energy economy in Illinois to communities and households that would otherwise not have access to the growing solar market here in Illinois, specifically targeting low-income and environmental justice communities across Illinois. Illinois Solar for All intends to engage income-eligible homeowners and renters, as well as nonprofit public facilities and nonprofits that serve low-income or environmental justice communities. These entities can participate in Illinois Solar for All within 4 sub-programs. Next slide. The first sub-program, the Low-Income Distributed Generation sub-program, incentivizes development of solar systems that connect behind the meter to low-income residences, both single and multifamily buildings. The nonprofit and public facilities subprogram incentivizes distributed generation systems that serve nonprofit or public sector facilities that serve and are located in low-income or environmental justice communities. The third subprogram, the Low-Income Community Solar subprogram, provides incentives for solar developments that are located off-site from its low-income resident subscribers. So these first 3 programs that I glossed over pretty quickly are administered by the Illinois Solar for All program administrator, Elevate Energy. What you'll also notice about these first 3 subprograms is that on each you see that the costs and fees won't exceed 50% of the value of electricity produced, and that there are no upfront costs to subscribers. These are 2 very important functions of Illinois Solar for All and benefits for participants to ensure that they are seeing significant savings by participation in Illinois Solar for All. Next slide. Oh, actually, previous slide. I did forget the low-income community solar pilots, which is the 4th subprogram. These are not administered by Elevate. This was a separate community solar procurement that was completed in late 2019 and has been eliminated under CEJA, which Anthony will be talking about. So next slide. So in order to participate in Illinois Solar for All, eligible households and nonprofit and public facilities are required to work with program approved vendors who are the parties of these rec incentive contracts and use those incentives to pass along required savings to the participants. They handle all aspects of the installation of the system, and they ensure that program requirements are met by providing minimum customer savings, engaging the communities in which they are doing solar development. They ensure that program consumer protection guidelines are met, and they perform customer acquisition and income verification activities. Potential approved vendors must first be approved vendors under the adjustable block program, and they have to maintain that registration as well as applying for registration as an Illinois Solar for All approved vendor. Approved vendors submit projects in batches during program submission windows or during rolling submission windows when applicable. And these rolling submission windows are used when available funding for a particular subprogram exceeds the eligible projects that were submitted during the initial project submission window. Once projects are approved by the program administrator and the Illinois Commerce Commission, then 15-year rec delivery contracts are executed between the approved vendor and either a utility or the IPA as a counterparty, depending on the funding source of that project's particular incentives, I'm sorry. Next slide. So there are a number of consumer protection guidelines in place for both the adjustable block program and Illinois Solar for All. As we just discussed, projects are developed by vetted approved vendors. These projects must include warranties and guarantees of workmanship. There are financial protections, so the participant does not bear undue financial risk. There are standard disclosure forms that have to be presented along with a standard program brochure before participant signs a contract with the approved vendor. There are also marketing requirements to ensure that the vendors receiving these incentives are advertising properly. So we really want to make sure that any activity that the approved vendors are doing are really representing the values of Illinois Solar for All in their work on Illinois Solar for All programs. The consumer protection that is unique to Illinois Solar for All are the cost and savings requirements. Generally speaking, Illinois Solar for All participants must see measurable savings on their electric costs, and they cannot be required to pay upfront costs prior to energization, as I said a few minutes ago. Next slide. So approved vendors participating in Illinois Solar for All are required to hire job trainees from eligible job training programs in Illinois. The first priority for hiring job trainees are hiring graduates of workforce development programs created under CEJA. When those are not available, if reasonable efforts have been unsuccessful in connecting the approved vendor with CEJA program trainees, then other qualifying training programs can be utilized. And Elevate keeps a list of these other qualifying programs, and they vet potential other training programs to be added to that list regularly. Approved vendors have portfolio requirements for these job training requirements, which increase each year of program participation by the AV. And they also have specific requirements for low-income distributed generation projects. So these distributed generation specific requirements include that at least 1/3 of all installations across the AV's distributed generation projects annually include at least one eligible trainee. There are no minimum hours or cumulative total hours for this requirement, just that projects utilize at least one eligible trainee. The low-income distributed generation only approved vendors still have to fulfill portfolio requirements. And it's important to note that the workforce development programs and the other qualifying programs are not under the control of the IPA or Elevate. Elevate is just trying to work with these programs to be able to facilitate the connection of these trainees with AVs that are trying to connect with them. Okay, next slide. So there are two sources for funding for Illinois Solar for All. The first is the Renewable Energy Resources Fund, also known as the RERF. And this is funded by alternative retail energy suppliers through alternative compliance payments. Contracts that are utilizing RERF funding contract with the state of Illinois or the IPA. The other funding source are Renewable Portfolio Standards, RPS funds, and these are utility-held renewable portfolio standard funds that are collected from ratepayers through bill riders that are specifically for funding renewable energy resources. Next slide. So in this chart, we see that the annual funding for allocations in the first 4 years. What you don't see in this chart is that unused funding rolls over to the next program year. And we'll see that a little bit later when we talk about the distributed generation program challenges. As an aside, this slide is found of this chart is found in the Illinois Solar for All Phase 2 Final Evaluation Report. And I'm just going to give a quick plug. Apprise Incorporated, Illinois Solar for All's independent program evaluator, will be presenting the findings of their report on Monday at 1:30. Central, so just in a few days. And this presentation will be a useful overview of program activities, successes, and challenges, and the evaluators' recommendations that are good to keep in mind as a context as we begin the process of updating the long-term plans and have opportunities for stakeholder feedback that will shape how Illinois Solar for All is administered going forward. So I really encourage you all to get the link for that webinar and sign up and join us on Monday. Okay, next slide. All right, one feature of Illinois Solar for All within CEJA is funding that can be used for educating communities on the basics of solar and driving program participation. The grassroots educators selected for contracts for educational campaigns were selected through a competitive RFP process. Grassroots educators are trusted members and service providers of their communities. Currently, we have 12 grassroots education campaigns that are going on all over the state. A list of these entities are available in a directory and a map on the Illinois Solar for All website. Some grassroots educators operate in a number of communities across the state, so that may not be represented on the map, but it is shown in the grassroots educator description. So when you're looking for grassroots educators in your area, you can talk to Elevate if you're trying to find someone close by. Next slide. CEJA required that Illinois Solar for All focus efforts and incentive, particularly toward environmental justice communities. Environmental justice communities demonstrate a higher risk of exposure to pollution and experience negative effects of that pollution more profoundly due to environmental and socioeconomic factors. Illinois Solar for All has a goal of at least 25% of program funds being allocated to projects in environmental justice communities, and additionally, up to 60% of the available grassroots education funding is awarded to grassroots education proposals targeting EJ communities. The process to determine which census block groups in Illinois are designated as EJ communities is determined by a process based on localized environmental and socioeconomic factors. The top 25% of the scored census block groups were then designated as environmental justice communities for the purposes of Illinois Solar for All, representing 2,422 out of the 9,683 census block groups in Illinois, and that translates to 3.1 million people or 1.2 million households. And just for context, the population of Illinois is roughly 12 million. We understand that there may be communities for which data is not available for certain vulnerable communities. So there is an option for communities to pursue self-designation as an environmental justice community for Illinois Solar for All. Proposals for self-designation must demonstrate conditions that are not represented by the current data that was used to select the designated environmental justice communities. But they are given opportunities to provide a variety of alternate supporting documentations that can make their case. Next slide. So in the next few slides, we'll discuss program impact, including successes and ongoing challenges. Next slide. In the first 3 program years, Illinois Solar for All allocated over $15 million in incentives for 130 projects, serving low-income residents and qualifying nonprofits and public facilities, with a combined nameplate capacity exceeding 22 megawatts of AC solar energy in Illinois. Of this 56 million, 71% or 39.8 million of these funds went to projects in environmental justice communities, and over 98% went to projects in the low-income communities. Next slide. The greatest ongoing challenge that we faced in Illinois Solar for All has been lower than anticipated participation in the low-income distributed generation subprogram. In this table, we show the total budget available for each program year, and the budget column shows rollover funds and the totals of approved projects and their values. I would note that for the current program year, in addition to the funds that the projects that we've listed here, we also have 11 projects waiting for ICC approval and about 25 more DG projects in review. So there have been measurable increases in interest and participation over the last 3 years, but there remains an opportunity for much more uptake in this sub-program. Elevate has taken a number of steps to try and address some of the barriers that we've heard about this program. They created a referral process that does a pre-screening for potential customers and connects those interested participants with approved vendors that are serving their areas. And as they also provide an option for the participant to verify their income directly with the program administrator rather than through the approved vendor. So trying to take some of the burden, that part of the burden off of the approved vendors, and also simplifying activities for the participants so it's easier on them. We also are, grassroots educators are also increasingly working one-on-one with potential participants through their activities, and they can help guide participants through the process of finding an approved vendor and evaluating offers. Next slide. Some vendor challenges that have come up with the prizes interviews with the in their activities evaluating solar for all include challenges meeting batch size requirements, having incentives that are paid on completion of projects rather than providing incentives that can help develop the project from the outset. There's consumer uncertainty and distrust in low-income communities about energy offers that are related to alternative retail energy suppliers. There are high customer acquisition costs, we've been told, and that renewable energy credit prices for Illinois Solar for All for this sub-program have been insufficient to address the development barriers and be able to pass along those required energy program savings still. Once again, another plug for the Illinois Solar for All program evaluation webinar on Monday. Glad we got that link in here. And at this point, I'm going to hand it over to the IPA Director, Anthony Starr, to discuss how CEJA will impact Illinois Solar for All moving forward.
Great, thank you, Jen and Mega. I'm Anthony Starr. I am the director of the Illinois Power Agency, and what I'm going to talk about next are some of the changes that are coming to Solar for All as a result of our new legislation. Jen, I think, did a great job of sort of laying out the groundwork of where we are with Illinois Solar for All that was created through the Future Energy Jobs Act, which was enacted at the end of 2016 and took effect in 2017. And really, it's a program really sort of, launched in early 2019. So still a young program, but with major energy legislation and some refinements to Illinois Solar for All. I want to talk through some of those changes. In general, the CEJA is groundbreaking legislation that makes major changes to the renewable energy industry of the state. The changes for Solar for All, while there are some significant ones, are probably not as extensive as what we're seeing in the other aspects of the programs and procurements that the Illinois Power Agency is running. When it comes to our utility scale procurement for large scale projects, we have a new way of pricing renewable energy credits, which are the incentives for developing projects that I think is designed to really expand the feasibility and attractiveness of those incentives. We have new options for large customers to interact with the clean energy economy in ways that they've not previously. In the adjustable block program, which is the solar incentive program that is not targeted for low-income communities, we have new categories of projects that are available. We have new emphasis on equity and diversity that cuts across all of those programs in really exciting and new ways. In Solar for All, I think we have some refinements and improvements, but maybe not as big changes as we see elsewhere. So I will talk through some of those. The first one is that we do have an increase in the funding. As Jen had described, there's two sources of funding for Illinois Solar for All. There's a Renewable Energy Resources Fund, which was funds that were collected from alternative suppliers that are contracts administered by the IPA. And then there's funding from the utilities each year that also helps support the program. One challenge that I think we had identified early on as we developed the program was that the Renewable Energy Resources Fund is a finite amount of money. Once it's used, it's used. And so what was going to be the growth path for Solar for All going forward? This has been addressed through the legislation by ramping up the amount that comes out of the budgets the utilities have for the RPS in general from about $11 million level that gets contributed to Solar for All each year. Now that'll be ramping up to $50 million a year. So that will help as the funds from the Renewable Energy Resources Fund are fully allocated. By having additional contributions from the utilities, we'll be able to have the Illinois Solar for All program continue and at higher levels. But then there were a number of what I call focus changes, language that has been added into law that I'll be going through in a moment that sort of help us sort of focus the purpose and goals of the program, broadening aspects of how to broaden participation, quite a bit of language around the concept of energy sovereignty, and also language to sort of clarify how we should be coordinating Solar for All with other programs. Then there are also specific program changes that I'll talk about. A new separation of multifamily program, some changes in how funding is allocated between programs, and also the end of the low-income community solar pilot procurement that I will describe in a moment. Next slide. So the first change in focus that I wanted to discuss is this following provision that is about where projects are located. That I think we've seen projects across the state. Our distributed generation projects have been located mostly in the Chicago area and generally more urbanized areas of the state. So I think there is a goal to really look carefully at where projects are going to be located in the state, where we've used a project selection protocol for the nonprofit and public facility subprogram, as well as the community low-income community solar subprogram, because we've had more applications come in each program year than funding that is available. So I think continuing to look at how we do project selection is one aspect of this. The other will be what is our ongoing efforts in terms of outreach and education to make sure that Solar for All is known better through the state and that there's more opportunities for participation. Next slide. Another aspect of the focus change for Solar for All is the concept of broadening participation. So a focus on small and emerging businesses. To date, looking at the distributed generation program, the program for residential solar, almost all of the activity has come from a large national solar company. Some of the multifamily projects have come from smaller approved vendors, but in general, the success in almost all of the residential projects have come from larger companies. Likewise, in community solar, we've seen more participation by larger community solar developers. The place where I think there's been the most success in terms of having a wide range of approved vendors, including smaller businesses participating, has been the nonprofit and public facility subprogram. But we're called upon in the legislation to really make sure that smaller businesses can participate in the program, and finding ways to have more active support to get new approved vendors into the program. We also will be increasing the reporting we'll be doing on participation in the program as well. So again, a focus on making sure that the benefits of Solar for All flow through to businesses across the state, as well as to individual households and communities. Next slide. Another aspect of the change in focus is the concept of energy sovereignty, which is the concept of increasing sort of the ownership of projects by low-income households, by organizations, in communities, and to make sure that energy ownership includes people having control over their projects and really are fully reaping the benefits of those programs. Each of the sub-programs of Solar for All has very similar language to basically ensure that a portion of the programs are really reserved for projects that meet this sort of concept. And this is one of those things that we will be looking at as we develop the next long-term plan, how to best define what energy sovereignty is. I think, it's one of those concepts that sounds very clear until you start getting into the details of how do we define what does ownership mean, how are we ensuring that those benefits flow through in the ways described here. So we will certainly be exploring this a lot in the weeks and months to come. There is also potential for higher REC prices for projects that have an energy sovereignty component. So one of the things we're going to be very interested in as we get into stakeholder feedback on our next plan is what are the costs, additional costs that would ensue when you have a project that features a local ownership component. Next slide. Another aspect of focus is making sure that we have more coordination between programs. So we have the adjustable block program and we have the Illinois Solar for All program. What can we do to reduce the barriers for adjustable block program approved vendors to participate in Solar for All? So the things we can do, anything we can do to really help have more sort of cross-pollination between the two programs. Solar for All is always going to have its distinctive requirements, and there are, in terms of the savings requirements, I think it is also important that we make sure that low-income households are not, are given solar offers that benefit them and have additional consumer protections above and beyond our robust consumer protections for the adjustable block program. But in general, finding ways to coordinate better between the programs will be a focus going forward. Next slide. Another change that it comes out of CEJA is a change in our funding allocations, how much is spent for each sub-program. So again, a shift in the allocation between the programs a bit. A key part of this has to do with the low-income community solar pilot procurement, which was one of the sub-programs that was initially part of the Future Energy Jobs Act for Solar for All, which was a procurement for community solar projects run through a competitive bid process rather than the sort of defined REC prices and project application process we use elsewhere in Solar for All, the adjustable block program. We ran one procurement through that program, as Jen mentioned, and there were 2 selected projects, and about $20 million of the available funding was allocated to those projects. Then CEJA now has removed the community low-income community solar pilot procurement, so we will not be holding another procurement. We had been planning one. We sort of slowed down a little bit on it as we saw drafts of language of legislation come out in the spring and through the summer, which was going to cut the funding. So we didn't move forward with that. Now, in fact, that has been removed. So that frees up money that from the Renewable Energy Resources Fund that would have otherwise gone to that procurement. Now it will now be available to support the other sub-programs. And again, we have this new shift that the residential distributed generation program now is going to be split into 2 separate programs. There are also some clarifications in the law about how these allocations apply across both the funding available from the Renewable Energy Resources Fund as well as those collected from the utilities. Next slide. So then there's some specific new requirements for Solar for All. Next slide. First, Jen had talked earlier about the job training requirements and how we had overall portfolio requirements for approved vendors in terms of percentage of hours worked, but then a specific language around in the low-income distributed generation program around a portion of projects that have commitments to hire job trainees. That sort of language that previously only was available for the distributed generation program now expands to the other sub-programs as well. So we'll be updating in the next long-term plan how the provisions around job training are now more concrete and specific across subprograms. Next slide. I've already mentioned this, but now the multifamily housing, 5+ unit housing, is now a separate subprogram within Illinois Solar for All. This, I think, is really codifies something that we kind of had in practice already, in the sense that we had already had different rec prices depending on the size of the unit, and we also already had within the distributed generation program specific considerations about how you do income verification in a multi-unit building and how you have the benefits of the solar project flow through to the residents of the building. Now we will have this as a separate subprogram. I think this really, to me, is something that just won't create huge changes to the program, but will allow us to probably be a little bit clearer in defining how we talk about different types of housing and how benefits flow through to the residents, whether it's a single family or small unit versus a larger building. Next slide. There was also a potential for additional programs. There have been some similar language previously for the idea that stakeholders could propose additional programs, but that's now been sort of fleshed out a little bit more for the idea that as we develop a long-term plan, there could be proposals for looking at other ways in which technologies, in particular storage, could benefit low-income customers. So that would be something that we're going to be very interested in stakeholder feedback on how storage could be considered as part of the future for low-income solar programs in Illinois. Next slide. There are also a number of program refinements. So there, Jen had talked a bit about steps we've already taken around income verification. This is one of those issues where what we've heard feedback from vendors is that there's a lot of costs that go into acquiring a customer. That's always going to be true in any sort of thing you're selling, but particularly those costs are very high in Solar for All because you do need to verify that someone is eligible for the program, which which income verification is not a simple matter. We also have requirements for the program around making sure that the home is suitable for solar. We don't want solar being put onto a home where the roof needs to be replaced in a year or two and the solar panels need to be removed. So in that sense, there's a lot of soft costs for developing a project. So by taking things that we've already started the process, I think, and making it clearer in the law that the program administrator will be doing some more actively involved in some the upfront identification and verification of customers is something I think that's designed to address some of the soft cost issues that we've heard as one of the challenges in finding uptake for residential customers. Another change is some clarification around grassroots education to be clearer about what qualifies as grassroots education, in particular that to come into the idea that grassroots education is education, not marketing. So that this is really to teach people about the benefits of solar, opportunities for things like job training programs, et cetera. This is our grassroots educators are not out there selling solar projects. One of the things I think we'll never know because of the challenges of the last few years is, they're out there talking to people, but it's been very hard the last year or so to engage with customers because of all the obviously meeting restrictions due to COVID. There are also a number of considerations around program administration, how to streamline and make it more efficient that are included in CEJA as well that we'll be addressing through the long-term plan. Next slide. Job training is also something that is shifting a bit. So one aspect of job training is that the funding for the job training programs, which are not administered by the Illinois Power Agency, is shifting from ComEd to the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity, and that process is ongoing. So there's a bit of sorting out going on external to the parts of Solar for All administered by the IPA on job training. But then there also are new requirements to help facilitate placement of graduates of job training. So our program administrator will be increased responsibilities on how to facilitate placement of graduates from those programs, including the development of a clearinghouse. I think so. A better ways for trainees to connect to companies and companies to find the trainees of these programs. So we will be working on better information flows. I think pieces of this are already underway to varying degrees, but again, we're given some new tools and mandates here to help clarify what we do to sort of connect the dots between job training and the Illinois Solar for All program. Next slide. Another aspect of the changes from CEJA are to clarify how Illinois Solar for All coordinates with other programs, in particular, the energy efficiency programs. And we've had some conversations with those programs, but we haven't, again, the pieces haven't quite clicked into place in terms of how do we marry Solar for All and the solar opportunities with other opportunities that might be available for low-income customers through energy efficiency programs. So we have some language that really helps clarify that, and we'll be using to make sure that we have better coordination going into the future. The other part of this that I think is interesting is that one of the challenges that we've seen in Solar for All is issues like deferred maintenance, where, as an example I just used a few minutes ago about how do you address an issue if someone's roof is not ready for solar panels. So there are a variety of programs created through CEJA outside of the work the IPA does, such as the Climate Bank, which is going to be administrated, sort of a green bank that'll be available for project funding, as well as the new Clean Energy Jobs and Justice Fund that's being established. These are potential sources for capital, both for approved vendors that might be able to help bridge the financing issue that Jen mentioned earlier in terms of the fact that the renewable energy credit incentives are not paid until projects are completed, as well as some of the sort of maintenance and upgrade of homes that might be needed in order to make them solar ready. So there's some other aspects of the broad suite of opportunities created by CEJA that will now be an opportunity for Illinois Solar for All to be able to use those as sort of a bridge to help connect all the pieces needed to make solar viable for low-income households. Next slide. Another thing that was included in CEJA was a codification of our current environmental justice approach. So Solar for All has a requirement that a portion of the projects be in environmental justice communities, as Jen showed in an earlier slide. We've been able to go well beyond those in terms of the percentage of projects that are located in those communities, which is a great thing. But in developing and defining environmental justice communities, we had to develop a methodology where we took from a variety of data sources that are out there, and we were inspired by some methodologies that were developed in California for defining environmental justice communities. And we developed a very rigorous data-driven methodology for environmental justice communities. What CEJA does is it basically sets into place that this is the methodology for how to think about environmental justice communities, that the approach that we use initially is what is supported. We will need to be doing things like update some of the data that went into that. Will be something that we'll be considering a update and refresh of that data as part of our next long-term plan. But again, this is, to me, is a validation of the approach we've used for defining environmental justice communities, which can be a very complicated issue, and that we have some guidance going forward for this being the method we'll use for thinking about environmental justice communities for the Illinois Solar for All program. Next slide. So a reminder of a few things related to the Illinois Solar for All program that are coming up. As Jen had mentioned, we have a webinar on Monday, a presentation by the third-party evaluator for their evaluation of the first several years of the program. And there's an evaluation report that's been released that has a lot of detail of both data about projects to date, as well as a lot of very interesting feedback from different levels of participants in the program on their experience and recommendations on what we can do to continue to refine those programs. And we've certainly taken those to heart along with our program administrator as we continue to try to improve the program. We also will be holding a workshop next week on the long-term plan. So through CEJA, we are developing an update to our long-term plan that will include various provisions of the Act that need to be updated in our plan so we can administer our programs. we are busy developing that for release in January. We will be releasing written requests for stakeholder feedback later today, and then having a workshop next week to give people an initial opportunity to provide feedback on some of those requests for information. And there'll be a number of questions specifically on solar for all, some of the things I sort of mentioned. How do we better define energy sovereignty, for example? We're really interested in people's feedback on those. And then we'll have I believe it's a December 3rd deadline for written feedback. So a lot coming up very soon on the development of our plan. And so we can take these ideas that are included in CEJA and begin to put them into the plan so that they can take effect when it gets approved next year and these program changes will take effect. I also want to circle back to the upcoming power hours that Megha mentioned at the beginning. We have this is the 3rd power hour we've held. We have 4 more scheduled over the balance of this year on other aspects of CEJA and its impact on the work of the Illinois Power Agency. And then finally, at the bottom, there's a link for if you want to register for any of those workshops or for the stakeholder feedback workshop, a link to where those will be located. And the stakeholder feedback will be posted on the IPA website as those are available later today. So with that, that concludes my presentation. I'll turn it back to Megha for our Q&A section.
Thank you, Anthony. Looks like we have gotten one question so far. The question is about job training, and the question is, are hiring of job trainee graduates required across all of CEJA, including ABP, or is it just for Illinois Solar for All?
The language I cited about the portion of projects is specific to the Illinois Solar for All program. There are equity commitments that will begin to be phased in the adjustable block program over time, but those are slightly different than purely just the hiring of job trainees.
Great, thank you. I am not seeing any other questions come through, but maybe we can give maybe 1 or 2 minutes to see if other questions would come in the chat box. Yes, so we just got one, and this question is about job training again. The question is, what support is there for developing new job training programs?
The Illinois Power Agency does not administer the job training program, so unfortunately, I may not be the right person to ask that question to. There are specific programs are defined in the law. We have allowed in Illinois Solar for All the qualification of other job training programs to be eligible for consideration of the graduates of those programs for the purpose of meeting the job training requirements. I would recommend reaching out to Elevate, who is the program administrator for Illinois Solar for All, if you have questions about job training programs and how they could qualify for use in our program.
Okay, another question we just got is, can you discuss the way in which environmental justice communities were identified?
Sure. Environmental justice communities were identified by using a methodology where we took data from the couple different sources, in particular US EPA database that I am suddenly forgetting the name of, EnviroScreen, and used it to, and then use a methodology that was developed in California to basically score every single census block in the state. And then we took the census blocks that had the 25% highest scores and designated those as environmental justice communities. We then also realized that because most people don't think of their community in terms of the shapes of their census tracts or census blocks, we allowed for a self-designation option where if the data didn't quite, match your local communities, a way in which people can come in and request consideration of other communities as environmental justice communities, if there are gaps in the data that would support that.
Thank you. Another question is, CEJA seems to left open the door to reallocating some or all of the administration scope to organizations other than Elevate. Is that a correct understanding?
There is language in CEJA that says we can consider additional program administrators. That is correct.
Great. Another question we've gotten is any idea on when and how the 17.5 million fund, RURF fund from the pilot projects will be allocated?
We'll be including that as we develop the budget proposals that will be included in the next long-term plan.
Great, thank you. Another question is on income verification. Is moving income verification from AVs to the program administrator meant to make things easier for participants, for AVs, or both?
I think it's meant to make it easier for both.
Great. I believe there's one other question. Can you confirm what the total annual funding will be each year?
Not yet, because again, that needs to be developed through our long-term plan. We'll be looking at the balances available for the Renewable Energy Resources Fund. And then there is language that we're to scale up the funding coming from the utilities up to $50 million, but we'll be proposing through the long-term plan what that scaling will look like.
Okay, great. I think we probably still have time for a few more questions. There is another question, and it's asking, there was a slide about exploring non-PV alternatives. Can you explain more?
I believe that was slide 31, if you want to go back to it.
Oh, I missed.
This is the language that's in the act about considering non-PV alternatives, with again with a specific mention on energy storage. It's pretty open-ended, and so we're definitely interested in stakeholder feedback on what this might look like and how would energy storage as part of solar project benefit a low-income customer. This is something that is new for the agency. So again, we're looking for stakeholder feedback on how to determine if there's a way in which a program could target this sector.
Great. Then another question is, will any projects not be selected in the prior year programs be funded as a result of the changes?
For each program year is a new program year. And again, we'll be developing a new plan, which will be taking effect for the following program year. So, you know, there might be an opportunity in that plan for any consideration change. But in general, we've looked at each program year as a distinct program year. But one of the key takeaways should be that the funding for the program will be expanding significantly.
Okay. Then there was another question. Can you send me more information on the equity components of the program with the timelines on implementation?
That's somewhat complicated to do because there are a large number of equity components throughout this CEJA, which, as many of you know, is a very, very long bill. We are developing our long-term plan, which we'll be releasing the draft of in January. In that, we will be summarizing all those provisions, how they apply to our programs. But at this point in time, we don't have a document that would succinctly summarize those all in one place.
And I think there is one last question. Are there any efforts to collaborate the two bills received from Illinois Solar for All? I understand ComEd is doing this for only a year through giveaway program.
I think this question is referring to the fact that for community solar subscriptions, there's a fee paid to the community solar provider. One of the provisions of CEJA, which is outside of the scope of the IPA, is a change in net metering tariffs from the utilities, which will allow them to consolidate billing for community solar along with the provision of net metering credits from Solar for All. So that is something that is coming as a change going forward. I'm not positive of what exactly the implementation timeline for the availability of that consolidation will be, but it is certainly something that will make community solar a lot simpler for participants.
Okay, and this is a comment. It would be very helpful to work towards some level of alignment between worker training requirements across Illinois Solar for All and ABP and state certification for DG.
So noted. We'll certainly keep that in account.
I believe we've addressed all of the questions at this point. Unless there are any more questions, I'm looking at the chat window. I don't see any. So on behalf of the Illinois Power Agency, I want to thank you all for joining the IPA Power Hour webinar today. We appreciate your participation. I also want to thank our presenters for taking the time out of their busy schedules to present this session. The next IPA Power Hour session, Impact of CEJA on utility scale solar and wind and brownfield sites will be held on Friday, November 19th. If you have not registered for the webinar yet, you can do so by going to the IPA website and clicking About Us. Under the Events tab, there is a registration. So with that, that concludes our webinar today. Thank you, everyone, and have a lovely day.